The morning after my son Michael's funeral, my daughter-in-law Emily knocked on my bedroom door holding a mug of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. I thought maybe she was finally about to cry. Instead, she sat on the edge of the chair across from me and asked how soon I thought I could be out of the house. I just stared at her, still wearing the black dress I'd slept in, thinking grief had made me hear wrong. But then she opened the folder and showed me printed listings for extended stay hotels, weekly rates already circled, like she'd been planning this before we even buried him. 2 years earlier, I had sold my own house to help Michael buy this one because he promised I would always have a place with him. A week later, sitting in his lawyer's office, Emily leaned toward me and whispered, "I hope you found somewhere cheap, Linda." Then the attorney opened a sealed packet my son had signed 3 months before he died, and that was the moment Emily realized Michael had known exactly who she was. Everyone kept telling me how strong Emily was at the hospital, how calm she seemed, how well she was holding everything together. And maybe they were right. Maybe grief freezes some people into quiet efficiency. But standing beside Michael's hospital bed while the machines had already gone silent and the doctor was speaking in that careful voice people use when they know nothing they say will matter, I noticed Emily asked 2 questions before anything else. She asked whether Michael's phone and laptop had been collected from his office yet, and then she asked whether the hospital needed updated insurance information. Neither question was wrong, and I told myself that over and over because grief makes people practical sometimes. But when your son has just died at 42 and his wife is asking about paperwork before she even touches his hand, something inside you quietly takes note. Not judgment exactly, just a small mark you don't understand yet. Over the next 2 days, Emily handled everything. She called the funeral home, coordinated the obituary, answered calls from coworkers and neighbors, and everyone praised her composure, saying she was being so strong, so organized, so steady. And I nodded along because I didn't want to seem unfair, but I couldn't stop noticing how quickly she made decisions without asking me, how naturally she spoke about arrangements like she was managing an event instead of burying her husband. And maybe that's how she coped, I kept telling myself. Maybe she needed control to keep from falling apart. But the morning before the visitation, I walked into the den looking for tissues and saw 3 framed photos sitting face down on the sideboard. They were family photos, one from last Thanksgiving, one from Michael's birthday, one from the lake trip 2 summers ago. All of them included me. The wedding photos were still displayed, pictures of Emily and Michael together were still there, but the ones where I stood beside him had been quietly turned over, like someone had decided they didn't belong anymore. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at my own reflection in the glass, trying to think of a reasonable explanation, until Emily stepped into the room behind me and said calmly she was just trying to keep things simple today. She didn't sound defensive, she sounded decided. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice, and after she walked away, I slowly turned the frames back upright, my hands trembling in a way I couldn't quite control. The visitation passed in a blur of hugs and quiet condolences, people telling me what a good son Michael had been, how kind he was, how dependable, and every word felt true, and every word made my chest ache because Michael had always tried to take care of everyone, even when he was exhausted, even when something was clearly weighing on him in the last few months. I remembered asking him once, about 3 months earlier, if everything was all right, and he had smiled too quickly and changed the subject, asking about my car tires instead, like he always did when he didn't want me worrying. That night after the burial, people gathered at the house for a small reception, and I stepped into the hallway for a moment to breathe when I heard Emily in the kitchen with her sister. I wasn't trying to listen, but then I heard her name. Her sister asked quietly, "What about Linda?" and Emily answered in a low, steady voice. She couldn't deal with that right now. There was a pause. Then her sister asked if Michael had ever put anything in writing. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Emily finally replied, "The house is straightforward." I stepped back before they saw me, my stomach tightening in a way I didn't fully understand yet. And later that night, sitting alone in the guest room where I had lived for nearly 2 years, I looked around at my things, the quilt my sister sent last winter, the lamp I bought after selling my old house, the small stack of books beside the bed, and for the first time the room didn't feel like mine anymore. Around 10, Emily knocked lightly and stood in the doorway, not coming all the way inside, her posture calm but distant, and she said softly she knew this was a terrible time, but tomorrow she thought we should talk about practical arrangements moving forward. Practical arrangements? She said it gently, but something in her voice felt prepared. After she left, I sat there replaying everything, the turned-down photos, the kitchen conversation, the words straightforward, and suddenly a quiet, uncomfortable thought settled in my chest. What if Emily wasn't reacting to Michael's death? What if she had already been preparing for life without me? And sitting there in that silent room, I realized something else that made my stomach tighten even more. If you were in my place after hearing all that, would you have trusted her, or would you have already started planning your own next move? The next morning, Emily was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed in jeans and a soft blue sweater, holding a mug in both hands, and for a second, the scene looked almost normal, like any quiet morning before work. But the house felt different now, quieter in a way that didn't come from grief alone. And when she saw me, she gave a small, polite smile and said she made coffee, the same words she had said hundreds of times before, except now there was distance in her voice, like something invisible had shifted overnight. I sat across from her at the table where Michael and I used to talk late into the night, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock filling the silence, until she set her mug down carefully and folded her hands together like someone preparing for a meeting rather than a conversation between family. And she said she had been thinking about the next few weeks and how everything was going to change. And even though her tone stayed gentle, something tightened in my chest because she didn't say we, she kept saying I. She needed time, she needed space, she needed to figure things out. And I nodded slowly because grief does require space, and I didn't want to make things harder. But then she said she thought it might be better if I found somewhere temporary for a while, and the word temporary hung between us like something soft but heavy. And I asked quietly what she meant by a while, and she hesitated just long enough to show she had already chosen her answer. A few months, maybe longer. And that was when I realized this wasn't about a few days of quiet. This was about me leaving the house I had come to think of as home. She reached beside her chair and picked up a thin folder, sliding it across the table toward me, and inside were printed pages, extended stay hotels nearby, weekly rates circled in pen, notes written in the margins about distance and availability. And for a moment, I just stared at the pages because it meant she hadn't thought about this last night. She had already planned it, researched it, decided it before we even had this conversation. She quickly added she wasn't trying to rush me, that she just wanted to help make things easier. But the fact that she had prepared this before even asking how I felt made something inside me shift. And I asked carefully whether Michael had ever talked to her about me staying long term. And she looked down briefly, then back at me, and answered that Michael wanted everyone to be comfortable, which wasn't really an answer at all. And when I mentioned that I had sold my house to help with the down payment 2 years earlier, she nodded sympathetically and said she appreciated that, but the house was in both her and Michael's names, and now legally it passed to her. And she said it gently, almost apologetically, but the meaning was clear. This house wasn't mine anymore. She added she would be willing to help me pack and even offered to ask her brother to bring boxes later in the week. And again, it sounded helpful, polite even, but everything about it assumed I was leaving. And as she spoke, her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at it quickly before turning it face down. And I suddenly wondered how many conversations about my moving had already happened without me. So I asked whether she had spoken to anyone about this already, and she paused before answering. She was just exploring options, and that careful phrasing told me she had. We sat in silence after that, the coffee growing cold between us, and when she finally left for an appointment, I remained at the table staring at the printed hotel list, noticing how neatly everything had been organized, how calmly she had explained it. And for the first time since Michael died, I realized something that made the house feel unfamiliar. Emily wasn't reacting to grief, she was reorganizing her life, and in that new version of her future, there simply wasn't a place for me anymore. And as I folded the pages back into the folder, I felt the quiet understanding settle deeper, because this didn't feel like a sudden decision. It felt like something she had already accepted, maybe even before Michael died. And sitting there alone in the quiet kitchen, I found myself wondering something I hadn't wanted to think before. If she had already planned my exit, then what else had she already decided about the life Michael left behind? And if you were sitting there holding that folder, would you have believed her kindness, or would you have started seeing it as something else entirely? 3 days later, I checked into an extended stay hotel on the edge of Columbus, not because Emily forced me to leave, but because staying in that house had started to feel like waiting for something that had already been decided, and the quiet beige hallway of the hotel, with its faint smell of coffee and distant hum of vending machines, felt strangely easier than walking past Michael's empty chair every morning, knowing I no longer belonged there. The first 2 days passed in a blur of practical tasks, forwarding my mail, calling my sister Karen in Pennsylvania, and trying to make sense of how quickly life had shifted, until on the fourth morning, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Michael's attorney, Daniel Levin, asking if I could come in for a brief meeting regarding an amendment Michael had filed 3 months earlier. And the wording alone made my stomach tighten, because it wasn't a general probate update, it was specific. And when I arrived at the office that afternoon, Emily was already seated in the waiting area, her posture composed but her fingers tapping lightly against her phone, a small nervous habit I had noticed before. When she saw me, her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, and she leaned toward me and said quietly she didn't realize I'd be involved, and I told her I didn't realize it either. Inside the office, Mr. Levin explained that most of Michael's assets transferred automatically to Emily through joint ownership and beneficiary designations. The house, retirement accounts, insurance, all standard, and I saw Emily's shoulders relax slightly as he spoke. But then he reached for another folder and said Michael had also filed a separate amendment establishing a brokerage account in my name, funded gradually over the past 2 years from Michael's personal income, and he explained Michael had written a short note stating the funds were meant to replace the money I had contributed when I sold my house to help with their down payment, and he handed me the statement showing the balance, just over $170,000, and for a moment I couldn't speak, not because of the amount alone, but because it meant Michael had been quietly planning, quietly protecting me, without ever making it feel like charity. Emily leaned forward and asked whether this had been discussed with her, and Mr. Levin calmly replied that Michael had the legal right to allocate funds from his personal income, and the room went quiet after that. Outside in the parking lot, Emily approached me with a softer tone than I had heard since before the funeral, saying everything had happened so quickly and she hoped there were no hard feelings, that grief makes people act differently, and I understood what she was trying to do, not manipulation exactly, but adjustment. And I told her honestly I didn't blame her for wanting space. Losing Michael had changed everything for both of us. She nodded, relief flickering briefly across her face, and we stood there for a moment, two people connected by the same loss, but already moving in separate directions. 2 weeks later, I signed papers on a small townhouse near my sister. Nothing large, just a quiet place with a small porch and enough room for my books. And when I unpacked the last box, I found the Thanksgiving photo, Michael's arm around my shoulder, both of us laughing. I placed it near the window where afternoon light touched the frame, and for the first time since the funeral, the silence felt steady instead of empty, because the real comfort wasn't the money or the townhouse. It was knowing that before he left, Michael had seen the future clearly enough to make sure I wouldn't face it alone. And sitting there, watching the sunlight shift across the floor, I realized something else quietly settling into place. Emily hadn't lost anything that had truly been hers, and I hadn't won anything that hadn't already belonged to me. And sometimes the quietest form of justice isn't confrontation or revenge. It's simply walking forward with the protection someone who loved you made sure you would have long before you even knew you'd need it.